Putin undoubtedly feared an independent, democratic, and affluent Ukraine on his doorstep, which is one of the compelling reasons why he may have started the war. Rather than a struggle caused by geopolitics, the Ukraine war can, with some justification, be viewed as a fight between the idea of an open society and authoritarianism, freedom versus tyranny. For Ukrainian, freedom and life are synonymous, which helps explain their extraordinary will to resist occupation. For Russians, liberty does not seem to be high up on the list of priorities. Many will favour perceived stability over the so-called chaos of freedom. Ukraine is a nation emerging from the amnesia of history and from under the yoke of centuries of imperial domination, and is taking its place as a pivotal territory within European history and politics. Welcome to Silicon Curtain. Please like and subscribe if you like the content we produce. It will really help other people find the fantastic guests that we feature. Paul Mason is a British commentator and radio personality. He was culture and digital editor of Channel 4 News, becoming the programme's economics editor in 2014, a post he formerly held at BBC Two's Newsnight programme. He is the author of several books and a visiting professor at the University of Wolverhampton. He's won many awards over his long writing and journalistic career, and most recently in 2018, Paul received the Ellen Makesins Wood Prize for his work on post-capitalism. In 2020, he was awarded the Eric Fromm Prize in recognition of his work on the revival of humanist Marxism. Paul, it's a great pleasure to speak to you, and especially as I have seen you over the years on the telly and been an admirer of your work. It's a huge pleasure to welcome you to the channel, introduce you to the audience.
Great, and nice to meet you. Good morning. I'm sitting in a caravan in deepest Pembrokeshire, at one of the westerly edges of the British Isles, and it's lovely and misty and remote.
And I'm keeping you from a walk on that, so we're gonna sort of have a fast-paced 45-minute dive into your journey from journalist to activist. But we're going to unpack a lot of stuff, and one of those topics that we're talking about, of course, is the support for Russia. And a lot of my speakers focus on that support insofar as it manifests on the extreme right of politics, not just America, but around the world. And of course, the weaponization of so-called family Christian values, etc. But there is also support from other wings of society, including the left. And we're going to try and balance things by examining all of this, aren't we? And why some Russian propaganda narratives work. Before we jump into that, I'd love to learn a bit more about, however, your journey from journalism to activism over the years.
Well, I'm still a journalist. I write every week for the New European. I write for Frankfurt, the Rundschau, and other magazines. I stopped doing news on TV because I wanted to have an independent political voice in British politics, and it was about the time of the Brexit referendum. And I just decided I can't go through this. Is going to cause it's part of a major breakdown in world order. I thought then that's what it was. So I can't live through it without sitting there, sort of as you have to do on the BBC, going on the one hand, on the other. And I think if you're going to be politically active, as I am in the Labour Party, and internationally as part of the left, you can't really do news. You can't. If you've written a book called Post-Capitalism, the job of chasing supermarket executives down the corridor when they've nearly driven the company to bankruptcy is for somebody else. So my journey is, I quit Channel 4 News as economics editor in 2016, just on the eve of Brexit. And since then, I've written, the last three books that I've written are about the situation we're in. One was Post-Capitalism, which was an attempt to give the left a meta project. I thought the problem with the left is that it kind of knows what it's against. There's no concept of what the outcomes are, apart from zero net carbon, which is not now a particularly left objective. The book before last, Clear Bright Future, which is the one that won the Bron Prize, was about humanism, and it was what it is an argument that says the Trump and sort of the worship of right wing a stepping stone or a gateway drug to a more thorough surrender of human. I basically, in the book, draw a line between what's happening with authoritarianism and what's happening with our submission to large corporations and their machine learning algorithms. And while I was writing that, it forced me into a decision point that I think many on the left are now confronting. So when the Soviet Union collapsed, I was in Russia in 1992, saw the collapse in real time, as maybe you did. When the Soviet Union collapsed, the left really was left fighting one thing, or resisting or trying to change one thing, which was free market capitalism and its effects on social inequality, racism, and the rest. Then added to that, we had the Iraq War, which I think was totally unjustified and indeed criminal. And that was the left's agenda. And people who had in the past defended the Soviet Union, thought it was a great idea, were nostalgic for it. They had no theory of its collapse. That's a really interesting thing, which we might explore in the current climate. So it was kind of okay for there to be a left that is not called Stalinists. People who were nostalgic for the Soviet Union were very bureaucratic and authoritarian, in fact, in their own psychology. And in 2018, writing this book about humanism, what I realized, or I kind of realized it, but what I formulated was the idea that left is a big problem. That left that wants that was nostalgic for an authoritarian Soviet society and Soviet regime is part of the problem, not part of the solution. And what it shares with right-wing thinking is systematic anti-humanism. And therefore, in writing a defense of the humanism of the left, including of the early Karl Marx, who condemned it? Who really went to town on attacking my book? Were two sets of left-wing people. One, the classic sort of Soviet nostalgics, the people with kind of pictures of literally pictures of Ho Chi Minh on their bedroom walls. And people they kind of quite cool with Stalin memes on the internet. But another set of people, those influenced by postmodernism and post-structuralism, were also really down on my book, which argues that humans have agency and can free themselves. And that was a moment where I realized this is going to cause there's going to be a huge split in the left. And coming up to speed now, I wrote this book about fascism and the emergent far right. But it's one the thought architecture, the ideological structure of modern fascism is its subject. But I think I would argue it's one of the few books that is on the left about the right that has taken head on the issue of so-called red-brown politics, the tendency of some left-wing people to gravitate towards rhetoric and themes and indeed sometimes even objectives that are classically far right. And I think the Ukraine war has unfortunately, my book came out before the war, but the Ukraine war has unfortunately proved we probably even need to focus even more on that problem. There are two lefts, they're incompatible. I'm on one side of it. I support Ukraine. I support internationalism, anti-racism. This other left is on a journey, and I don't like the look of where it's headed.
And it's interesting you mentioned things like agency, responsibility, and also plurality. And I think that's a struggle which, to be non-partisan can be applied to left and right, can't it? I mean, some of the ideas on the extreme wings are just not subtle enough, and they're not solution oriented. So, oligarchy and oligarchic influence on the media is just as dangerous as sort of big monolithic state-owned perhaps enterprises that don't have sort of flexibility to change, etc., or the tendency to take agency away, take responsibility away from individuals or their ability to self-organize is not just on the left or the right. It's a kind of universal problem.
Well, I think it's become a universal problem, and in my books I try to explore why that is. For me, I think I grew up in a society where there was agency. Working class town near Manchester, in the north of England, in the 60s. My dad was a truck driver, and I grew everything around me, and above all, the workplace was a zone of semi-autonomy for working class people. You expected to have political arguments in the workplace. You expected there to be free discussion of everything, which would include, of course, some racism, but it would also include socialism. And what I think happened is that that culture, that working class culture, was destroyed. It was destroyed by Margaret Thatcher during the time of the 1980s. And what we then had is very atomized society, and into it comes the free market. What I think now, the kind of free market doctrine, not simply the economic fact of everything is market. If you go back, in one of my books, I picture a childhood scene. I went to a big festival held by miners every year called a miners' gala, and on that field, every miner, and almost a large number of their wives, would have been employed by the state, and their children went to school, provided by the state. Those who went to university went free, like me, provided by the state. The milk we drank at school was free. The meals we had at school were largely free. The social housing people lived in the rent was negligible. The cost of utilities was negligible. So the state was everywhere in our lives, and we had a large degree of autonomy. If you go to a workplace now, I went to get my car fixed in a factory district outside London this week, and what struck me is how controlled it is, how no one makes a joke, no one really wants to talk to anybody. Everyone's getting on with their task, and they're just desperate to get away from work. Work is not a zone of anything like liberation. I think what we've done is we've treated the market as the free market economists treat it, which is, it's a giant computer that knows better than you. Don't try and mess with it. Don't try and alter its decisions. That's the worst thing you can do, because you can mess up the machine. Let the machine calculate its outcomes, and the more you obey those outcomes, the happier you're going to be. That, for me, sums up neoliberal ideology. Now, that's fine if neoliberalism works, but in 2008, and I saw it with my own eyes on Fifth Avenue, New York City, the machine broke down, the computer crashed. Lehman Brothers went bust, and so did almost half of the American banking system. We kept the economy on life support, but you can't keep an ideology on life support. People's brains started to go, look, this idea that the market is making me happy isn't right. So what other ideologies are there? And I think since about 2011, we've been in this ideological turmoil in the West, where people are looking for alternatives to the computer that can decide things for you. The market computer broke down. For so many people on the right of America, who many of them, almost every single one of them, to be honest, when I was looking at, say, the Tea Party movement in 2008, 9, 10, they were libertarians. But there's this pipeline from libertarianism to authoritarianism that I think many in America have flooded down, and I think that it's also true in places like Brazil, and it's very true of parts of the European far right. So we're seeing people now say, well, libertarianism, natural law, doesn't answer anything, any question, to be honest, in a time of extreme crisis. Authoritarianism does. And so we've seen the right authoritarianism, and into that, and this is the subject of my book, into that we get the recrudescence of actual fascism, actual theorized fascism, the works of people like Dugin, Carvalho, some of the American far right thinkers. They're theoreticians, and one of the reasons that they're so popular is that it does completely replace the market system and the market ideology that has failed. And the task for liberalism and the task for the left, or each in our own different way, is to come up with answers, because that's what your classic person with the horns on January the 6th, the kind of mad looking people who stormed the Capitol, in general, I think, are people looking for a single answer to the question, how do I live? What explains the world? So liberalism and socialism have to explain the world, and
some of the people, I know some of the people sort of watching this channel will probably be screaming, well, on the extreme left, which you mentioned a minute ago, that's also potentially, on a great game of snakes and ladders, there's also a route to authoritarianism on the extreme left and the extreme right. And I think the debate needs to be non-partisan, in that we need to say there are mechanisms at play here, which are not purely ideological. It's almost like sort of, gravity will clump matter together into ever bigger and bigger systems. And if you apply that to an economy, there's no such thing as a free market, because those forces will inevitably create monopolistic entities or concentrations of power. And you'll go from increasing efficiency, and at some point, you go down the other side of the bell curve into decreasing efficiency if you let the market just do its thing without any kind of regulation or any kind of vision of where you want to take it. And I think it's important for the audience to understand that we're not talking here about a partisan debate. I think something that's absolutely fascinating is the role of mainstream media, because if you have a society with increasing oligarchy, with increasing monopolistic power, and far less, say, freedoms in the workplace that you've described, then the role of the mainstream media, like the BBC, with the two sides argument, that almost, it's like having a steering defect. It almost favors the slide towards authoritarianism if you have the sort of, all points of view have equal merit.
Well, look, I don't mind the fact that the BBC is by statute impartial, and has to try and sort of speak peace from nation to nation. All that's good, but we're in a world of information asymmetry. And before we even get into the question of left right, the biggest asymmetry is between corporations and individuals. Tesco, one of the big supermarkets where I shop, knows more about me than I know about me. Google knows more about me than I know about me. Apple probably likewise. Cambridge Analytica, in the famous 2016 case, was said to hold 5,000 data points about every American. Well, I can't remember 5,000 facts about myself, and I certainly can't mobilize them as if they were a kind of instant database. I'm doing instinctual things with my brain, which is fine for me, and that does mobilize lots of innate and interior knowledge. Instinct can't beat methodology. And so the big information asymmetry is between corporations who can now exert algorithmic control over people and people. That's the subject of my book, Clear Bright Future. So on top of that, you've got states. Actually, I think states in Western society are losing the battle to corporations. States can't. Corporations can know everything, but they can't action much legally. They can't arrest you. States have to sort of, no matter how much processing power they have and how much surveillance power, they have to focus it on threats. And so, nevertheless, the state is pretty knowledgeable about me if it wants to be. And then the other problem is other states, enemy states, can be. I mean, famously, I was the victim of a hack and leak and smear campaign it now appears the GRU were behind that, the so-called Seaborgium hacking group, which has been the subject of several investigations, and indeed, in my case, is the subject of a law enforcement and investigation here. But that's the Russian state. It knows a lot about me. It knows so much about me that it can fake my emails. Then there's the individual, and what's the individual supposed to do? I hate the fact, but I can totally understand the fact that some people's response to this is to align themselves with corporations or states, and the incentives to be a free individual human being, expressing your own agency, defying orders to buy this, defying playlists that appear on your Spotify, defying invitations to act in certain ways by states and corporations. It's quite hard to be that person. And so I think one of the things we could talk about the left, one of the absolutely basic things is so many people on the far left, or what I call the tanky left, the kind of pro-Russian, are obsessed with what they call owning the libs, differentiating themselves from and attacking liberalism. And you find it in magazines like Jacobin. Some of their writers say, Hillary Clinton was worse than Trump. It's just attacking liberalism is not the number one task of the left. Understanding our shared desire with liberalism to defend and extend individual human freedom is what I think is the basis of the political alliance that will defeat Russia, that will defeat Ukraine, that will defeat Viktor Orban, that will eventually engage with the China that is post Xi Jinping. All of these things, I think, it's why I, as and I am a pretty left person. We have to be in solidarity with the victims of totalitarian regimes, and they're no longer just authoritarian. We're talking about something akin to fascism in Russia. We've got to be in solidarity with them. That is the biggest problem in the world. American democracy is flawed. Yes, the attack on Roe v. Wade was appalling, but that's all part of a much bigger thing, which is the breakdown of a global order based on rules, based on universal rights. So the first thing to do is to defend the universality of the human experience and human rights. And that, unfortunately, that's the moment the postmodernists come into your ear and say, no, but there is no human being. There is no universality. Universalism is racist. The same time in the other ear, you've got Xi Jinping and his apologists saying universalism is racist. You are trying to impose the Western way of life on our lovely democracy where there's only one party.
And that's a classic mechanic of Russian propaganda. It starts with whataboutism, and then, as you say, it ends with a complete nihilism. And it's no wonder that one of the architects of Putin's propaganda machine was Vladislav Surkov, who is a postmodern absurdist drama, or he wrote a novel in that vein. And it's a very theatrical, very cynical kind of construct.
Let's talk a bit about Russia and what it's up to. For me, what's going on? What is the 20,000-foot picture of what's going on in the world? Is that the post-war, post-1945 order is breaking down. It's breaking down. The first reason it is. This is what frustrates me with some of the liberal commentary about this, is that there's a lawfulness to its breakdown. And I am a bit of an economic historian. I've written about economic history. Charles Kindleberger, who was the doyen of the history of the Depression and the post-war period, writes that the problem with world orders is that they eventually we saw this with British power in the 19th century, holding together a rough world order around the gold standard and the imperial systems. It broke down, and the First World War and the Second World War were essentially driven by that breakdown. And in the interwar period, the USA couldn't emerge as a new hegemonic and didn't want to. Large parts of its population didn't want to play a world leading role. And Kindleberger says, you have to take everybody's paper. That is, you have to lend to everybody. You have to set standards for every other country, prepared to absorb surpluses, i.e., gluts and surpluses. But you buy it. You act as the kind of daddy of the system, to be a bit patriarchal about it. And the USA, right the way through the post-war period, right the way through the post-Cold War, so after the breakdown of the Soviet Union, the Eastern Bloc, was acting like that. And we had that famous moment, Krauthammer, the unipolar world. Thomas Friedman's famous, triumphal declaration that behind the velvet glove of McDonald's lies the iron fist of McDonnell Douglas, and that's the world order. Suck it up. That's gone. It's gone because China is rising. And I've been to China 6 times, spent a month there each time, had access to the Chinese bureaucracy when I was a BBC journalist and Channel 4 journalist, and they will never lament the rise of their own country. They will never say, how terrible is it that we now have roads and railways and not starving, and that our children can read? How terrible is that? They're not going to reverse out of the development path. So get used to it. The point is, this eruption of Chinese power into the world has, I think, then signaled to Russia that it has a problem. Problem number one, as you know, as someone who has lived there, I was only there briefly during that horrific, chaotic period of Yeltsin and the 500% inflation, people selling their last goods on the street in the snow. They have developed the great Russian chauvinism, which we as leftists, we all read Lenin, and Lenin was a big, I hate great Russian chauvinism, but I don't think any of us understood how deep it is. The idea that big Russia, when it's not great Russia like Great Britain, big Russia should own all the other little Russias. The famous Ukraine is Little Russia, Belarus, and then all the stands, and then all the Caucasus. That's ours, okay? And no one messes with that. Therefore, we're a sixth of the world's surface. We are a great nation. Actually, it's an illusion. It was always an illusion. I mean, they are a lovely people, and their culture is a great culture. But no, set against a Western, a Western bloc, a collective Western economy, and a collective Western civil society of 1.5 billion people. People the Chinese called the golden billion. That's not so much. That's not so much to play with. What they did have was oil and gas and natural resources. And that once, if China had said, "Oh, never mind climate change. We're not going to play the ball of the Kyoto Treaty. You're not going to do Copenhagen. Not going to do Paris. Let's just forget climate change and go for broke on fossil fuels." Maybe Russia could have said, "Well, we have a future." Every Russian oligarch and every Russian Siloviki knows that the carbon economy is time limited, and therefore their power is time limited. And without carbon, they've got maybe 20 or 30-year period now to crack around in their periphery and get what they can. And without carbon, their oligarchic power is gone. China doesn't need, in this sense, the Chinese oligarchy is not based on carbon. It's based on the super extraction of profit from semi-slave labor, from people who live in dormitories and have no rights. That will take some change. But we can see the path to the doom of the Russian oligarchy really clearly, and I think they can. And that's what I think has prompted them to be the first of the big powers to say, you know what, this system doesn't work. This system of rules, of treaties, the Westphalian system itself. And here's the big difference, which is what makes me that Russia the problem number one in this world, is that their right-wing ideology, the right-wing ethno-nationalism that drives this, is also very nihilistic. There is nihilism built into the romanticism of 19th century Russia, going right back to the Narodniks, right back to Dostoevsky. We could discuss why that is. China is not a nihilistic society. China is a very fun society. It has a civil society that's open. Even in a repressive state with the policeman on the corner, people will make jokes and they will take the piss out of each other. They will just, it's a chaotic, vibrant, what did Bergson, I think somebody once said it's like Bergson's Elan Vital. It's life itself, Shanghai. Russia's not, and it's in trouble. And we need to, as an internationalist, I want to reach out to my Russian friends, many of whom I've had over the years, some of whom are now in exile, and they are trapped in a semi-fascist totalitarian fantasy.
It's interesting, isn't it?
Run by oligarchs. Yeah.
When we're talking about the sort of big geopolitics, these more humane characteristics are quite interesting. And this is one of the first impressions I got in Russia, and it was the mother of a friend of mine had done a lot of sort of missionary work through Africa, and been to some of the sort of most poorest parts, some of the most chaotic parts, recovering from war and so on. And she said, no matter where you go in Africa, you will find people who have an optimistic outlook. Despite the most terrible hardships, people will find some kind of joy, whether it be in sort of food, music, movement, what a sport, or culture. You have ultimately, a positive outlook. And I think it's interesting that you say that about China, because the impression I get is China, despite all of its turbulent history and being slammed at the moment with Xi Jinping, it is able to transmit elements of its culture from generation to generation, and has a dynamism about it, which despite all the repressions, you can still look at that dynamism and say, well, that's an impressive thing. Let's try to harness that. Russia is essentially a miserable place. And this person who came to spend a few weeks in Moscow, she said, oh my God, the people are grey, the streets are grey. and everything seems to be backward looking, and that does still permeate, I think, a lot of the place.
Well, look, I mean, I wouldn't like to stereotype because isn't it, but on my first trip to Russia, which was in January 1992, as I say, it was chaos. And what we were trying to do as journalists, left journalists, was to connect with the anti-Stalinist left. You know, there was this big Communist Party, which was then in transmit, and they were. I can remember going on a demonstration where there was the Communist Party generals with their medals, and then Zhirinovsky, you know, right-wing nationalists. They were quite happy alongside each other. And I looked at it, and I thought, bloody hell, we're going to make nothing out of this. But you know, I can remember one genuine leftist saying to me, "The thing about Russians, we can stand a lot because you know the summer's very hot, the winter's freezing, and that's how you make steel: heat and cold. You know, fire and ice. That's what makes steel strong." But what they've just found out is so are Ukrainians. And it turns out that Ukraine, in a brief time of, I think, a brief time of breaking out of its semi-breakout of oligarchic rule, has created something more resilient. I've only been to Ukraine twice. I went once in 2011, when we all expected there to be and the economic crisis to spread to the post-Soviet world, and it was very oligarchic. Ukrainian conservative Ukraine expert said to me last year, "You're interested in the working class." She said, "Well, you're going to find a lot of working class people in Ukraine because all there are workers and oligarchs, in the sense that the middle is there, but it's very small." But when I went in 2011, I found the oligarchs ruled. Everything you did was basically controlled by them, and you know, we were meeting people who own strip clubs and horrible stuff like that. These people you have to interview when you're a journalist. 2022, on the eve of the war, I went in just 5 days before the war started, and what's changed? There are kids on Kresiak, you know, doing this dancing you do on TikTok. The society was much freer, much more liberal in its attitudes. The young didn't, certainly in Kiev itself, the young didn't seem horribly alienated from the society they lived in, beach, except for, you know, outright fascists and Stalinists. And what struck me, you know, even on very solemn days, because it was the memorial, it was the day when you commemorate the Heavenly Hundred, the people who died in the 2014 uprising. Even on days like that, you could see a lot of positivity and hope. And of course, 4 days later, slammed by surface-to-surface missiles. So we are talking about we're talking about a war, a conflict between ways that human beings want to live. And for me, that is what the Ukraine conflict has become about. And it's why I've devoted much of the last 13 months to building solidarity here. As a journalist, I could have stayed there. I was invited to stay there, and here's a cheap flak jacket. What I think is more important for those of us who have some political clout is to absolutely make sure and shore up. And this is what the work I've been doing. The British support for Ukraine, and that means shoring up the left and the Labour Party and the trade union support, which is what I've been doing.
And the last question, I think, will bring these themes together. We've talked about oligarchy all the way through. We've talked about authoritarian slide. And you've painted this picture then of Ukraine's society over this 30-year period, and much more rapidly in the last 10 years, has developed a civil society. In parallel to that, they've also been undertaking judicial reforms, which gets far less attention, but they've been making some headway with quite slow, but judicial reforms and fighting against corruption. But what goes kind of, I think, unobserved, but which has a crucial role in the emergence of Ukraine, as you've said, in its resilience, but also is the lesson I think we have to learn in fighting oligarchy and corporations in this country, is the emergence of small businesses. It's that SME kind of sector where you have more and more of the population not in these monolithic industries or not as part of the huge siloviki security apparatus as you have in Russia, but you have a big chunk of society who own and manage their own businesses, who have a level playing field, who have rules that prevent, unfair advantages to larger corporations against them. And these are individuals who can not just bolster an efficient economy, but also through taking ownership and responsibility in their own lives, can also bolster democracy as well.
Yes, but let's not over romanticize the SME as against an organized working class, because when I was in Kiev, I was in Kiev on the day that the Russian troops went into when Russia officially seized the Donbass 2 days before the full scale war, and we were in the HQ of the trade union federation that represents miners in Kiev. Obviously, most of the miners are in Donbass or in the east of the country. The room was just full of something you almost don't see in a country like Britain anymore. A male manual workforce, relatively low educated. The room was full, and what they were saying is, many of us lived in the DNR, LNR. Many of us we lived in the place that's now controlled by Russia. They smashed up our union, so they destroyed some of the coal mines themselves. They tortured and killed union activists. We fled that. We are not fleeing again. We are going back. They would say, goodbye. We are going back. I've got a gun in my cupboard at home. Hunting rifle. I'm off. That level of agency, determination. This is not mere patriotism. You have to. I mean, there are people who, for example, the ostensible subject of the meeting was what we're going to do against privatization. What are we going to do about the fact that the Zelensky government keeps trying to seize trade union property, which was under the Soviet system, trade unions had buildings. There are many workers, railway workers, miners, teachers, who don't like the neoliberal policy and program of the Zelensky government. And I think in the reconstruction phase, some of these class issues will come out, because it's absolutely clear that there is an economic prize for the West, and above all for the USA, which is these giant steel plants, giant nuclear power plants. Once the war is over, the next phase of economic liberalism will be proposed, and the question will be who owns them. And the railways, Macron went to Kiev to try and sort of persuade them into some kind of a peace deal about 2 weeks before the war started. Came back with a €3 billion contract for Alstom, the French railway firm. I mean, in other words, the post-war form of the Ukrainian economy is going to be the subject of the social struggle. But even those most extremely engaged in it, so the people I would work with and sympathize with in Ukraine are left groups like Socialny Ruch and SD Platform, which are both left social democratic left groups. We've been making solidarity with them. They have people at the front. They've got nothing to do with this, kind of red-brown old Stalinism, some of which is repressed and legally suppressed, rightly. And so I think that they have what they share with the kind of liberal oligarchy from which the servants of the people, a kind of liberal anti-oligarchy, but still, I would argue, tainted with oligarchy. They're the servants of the people, and very diverse in terms of its. There are some very good politicians, some not so good. What the left in Ukraine shares with them is that first of all, we're not going to be defeated by Russia. We are not going to have yet another decades and decades of the suppression of Ukrainian national life, culture, language. We don't want to live under fascism, thank you, because even though Ukraine is oligarchic, trade unions can function and socialist parties can function under that, and they cannot function in any way, shape, or form under the kind of society Putin is imposing. Absolutely. In places like Mariupol. So there's that. But I think that here in the West, people, left-wing people like me, will go on supporting the trade unions and the left in Ukraine. What we must do is, and it's taken a long while, it's to convince the political elites of the West that Russia can be defeated. I think you see Macron, you see Scholz. For all that I've given Scholz a lot of credit for enacting the Zeitenwende, their initial approach was Ukraine's going to fold. It's all going to be too horrible. Russia, is such a nuclear threat, and it emanates unilateral nuclear threats all the time. Let's make this go away. And if we look back, we're only now looking at potentially F-16s. Only halfway through did they get sufficient supplies of HIMARS, long-range artillery. If the West had believed in itself at the start and said, no, all of that's going now, today, the Challengers, the Leopards, the HIMARS is going now, the Norwegians anti-ship missiles, now, today, we wouldn't be in this situation. The war would be over. As it is, I think we've spoken about nihilism. For British and Western military thinkers, one of the appalling things is, since 1945, they have rehearsed and practiced the idea of warfare against a rational actor. And the purpose of coercion or even deterrence is to make the adversary take rational decisions not to do things. So don't attack us because you're going to be defeated, is the general, or as we sometimes say, fuck around and find out, is the approach of deterrence in the West. We're now dealing with, in Russia, such a nihilistic cast of people, the Solovyevs, the Simonyans, Putin himself. They don't care whether they live or die. That's the famous Hannah Arendt quote about fascists. They don't care whether they live or die or whether they had ever lived at all. They're nihilist. And in that's a problem because it creates a non-rational adversary. The way to deal with a non-rational adversary is, if you've got a robot attacking you, but you can't reason with it, you just have to switch it off. And I think that this is what we've now. Let me be clear what I mean there. Putin needs to go to The Hague. There's no other way out of this than that somebody in Russia decides we've had enough of this. Putin is the problem. Putin and his Siloviki mates can get lost and go send a handful of them to The Hague, make peace, stop attacking other countries. There's still a role for Russia in the world order. It could still do a peacemaking role in Azerbaijan, Armenia. It could still sign all the energy contracts it wants with China and let as many Chinese people live in Eastern Russia as it wants. It can do all of that, but it has to stop attacking other countries. I feel that there is a wide range of political opinion. I'm on the left, liberalism, conservatism, social democracy in the West that should and could gravitate to that as the strategic stance. Because if we don't, then the world order that our grandfathers fought for, go to have created. And I, as a Labour member, am incredibly proud of Labour's role in creating the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and NATO in 1948. Who helped create that? That's all gone if we let Russia do what it wants to do. And the other part of it is, I know we're rapid going on a bit here, but let me finish on this. As someone who's studied the history of the Russian Revolution in 1917, one of the striking things is the Imperial Russian army collapsed in a particular way. It wasn't true that the workers, that the soldiers at the front simply said, we're getting defeated, throw away the rifles, run away. But they were doing that. The February Revolution, Kerensky comes along and politicizes the Imperial Russian army. That is, it was the Kerensky liberals who set up the soldiers' committees and politicized the Russian the Russian army. And the Bolsheviks moved into that and formed the Soldiers' Soviets. So the Russian armies have a style of failure, and it is not simply surrendering, it is revolt. There's organized political revolt and politicization in the armed forces. I think this is going on. I think that one of the big functions of Wagner Group is that it's really there to police and prevent that. as soon as Wagner Group is out of the picture, and I think there are some signs that someone somewhere is not so happy with the Wagner Group recently. If Wagner Group were out of the picture, the Russian army would disintegrate much quicker. So I think, again, we in the West, we have it's tough. It's tough love. That's what needs to happen. The moment that starts, I think Vladimir Putin is on the way to The Hague, and I think that the rest of the Russian oligarch elite will understand that this adventure has failed, and let the Ukrainian people live their lives in peace and reconstruct in peace and mourn the very, very considerable losses of life, which we in the West don't know about. That's what needs to happen.
And of course, studying Russian history, it shows that change can happen extremely suddenly, often unexpectedly. The collapse of the Soviet Union.
All history is that we've lived in a time of peace and relative tranquility. All history occurs that way. As someone who is a critical Marxist, it's because the economy and technology and human capital develops, and the institutions that are there to hold it together can't hold it together. I think we in the West we didn't talk about it. We in the West have a big change that we need to go through to meet our challenges. But yeah, there's a great book. I've forgotten the name of the author about the end of about the perestroika period. It's titled, we should probably end on this thought. It's this. The title is "First It Was Forever, Then It Was No More," and that's the how perestroika happened. First, the Soviet Union was forever, and then it was no more in 5 years. And people knew it was coming, but they couldn't express what was going to happen. I think it's very clear that first it was forever, then it was no more is going to be the epitaph of Vladimir.
Peter Porantsev's got a nice one as well, wasn't it? It was a long time ago, and it never happened anyway. Or maybe that was David Satter. I think there's some great titles there. Well, there's loads more we could unpack here. I think in the coming months there will be plenty of material to explore further. But this has been absolutely fascinating, and I'm hugely grateful to you for sharing your insights with the audience here. And I know it will generate a ton of comment. Hopefully, most of that will be engaging and constructive.
Good. And buy my book, How to Stop Fascism: History, Ideology, Resistance.
We'll put the links into the description of the video. Thank you so much, Paul.